Yeah, so before we jump into Bill's lecture tonight, first of all, I want to say thank you again to Jim for kind of kicking this whole thing off and initiating with the idea. And I think it's been a great thing while we're all at home to be able to be challenged and learning new things. And I'm excited for Bill's lecture tonight. So thank you to Bill also for the hard work he's put into making this happen.
Yep.
So really quickly, I'm going to turn it over to Jim because he's got an idea about maybe kind of keeping this going a little bit. So Jim, why don't you give us your blurb here?
Sure. I'll make it quick. I think that it's been an enjoyable experience for me, and I think probably for Bill and Tyler as well. I don't want to speak for them, but I see them nodding their heads up and down. And I certainly have appreciated hearing from both of them. And there are other folks who can teach in our congregation as well. And John Haberlin is here, and Joe Bettridge is here, and Rich Bauckham is here. And, we saw all of that demonstrated in Holy Week in the devotionals that were being done for each day, and how much you all appreciated that. And so if you'd like to keep this going for a few weeks, I'm certainly willing to do that. I'm not going to speak for Bill. I haven't spoken with John or with Joe or with Rich yet, but I intend to. Just kind of see how this continues to develop. I'd really be interested in taking what we've learned about the world of the New Testament and then kind of applying it to some New Testament texts more directly, and spending some more of our time, now that we know some of this stuff, on seeing how it really helps us understand more about the New Testament and the writings that we find there. So I don't know, Tyler, how you want to kind of evaluate this with people, but if people want to keep going, maybe they could email or something like that, or we could just test it out for a week or two. It doesn't matter to me.
Yeah, email's great, or even at the end of tonight when you're all unmuted again. And just some verbal confirmation too and maybe if there's something that you're like, I'm really interested now that I have this background, I'm really interested. Yeah. Could we dive into this? That would be another way to go too. So we'll give an opportunity to maybe talk about what things might look like moving forward. I know I have received a few emails from people who have asked, are we going to do anything more like this? So there's your answer, at least in the short term. But so just tuck that away, and we'll talk about it a little bit at the end, or you can email throughout the week. But without further ado, I will now hand it over to Bill, and I will let him take it away.
Okay, take it away. There's something sounds ominous about that a little. While we're still on the subject, I want to say thank you and my appreciation to Pastor Jim and Pastor Tyler for this opportunity to teach like this. Tyler's age notwithstanding, I feel like the little boy or the younger brother at this particular feast that we've had over the last 6 weeks. I've never in 40 years of ministry ever talked to a church that has had Sunday school for adults on this level, and I appreciate it. The only hitch is that I found myself thinking pretty highly of myself, that I could say this on the Monday that I was going to teach, and I could say that on the Monday I was going to teach, and then sure enough, Jim would blow that right out of the water, and then the next week, Pastor Tyler would blow that one right out of the water. It has been absolutely amazing, not only in the accuracy of what they've been teaching, but the level of insight or the level of maturity, the kind of, not the storytelling and not the two-dimensional Christmas card kind of story about early Christianity and the New Testament world, but really good stuff to grapple with and to help us understand how to grapple today with the issues of conflict, of the growing understanding of Christianity, of ordinary people accepting Christ as their Lord, their Messiah, and then having to figure out what in the world that means. And I've been thinking, as we've been looking at the news over the last week or so, that this subject has never been more relevant to me personally. And I trust that it is the kind of thing that we as Presbyterians could be using to bring a mature, a full orbed idea of the scriptures, not the easy Hallmark card answer or the little paste on phrase. Sometimes we just throw a little ditty at somebody and tell them be warm and be healed. But this is still a world that was at least as complex as ours. And so I feel like a privilege to be able to talk to it tonight, but I also come with a measure of worry and anxiety. So you'll pray for me, won't you? The subject we're talking tonight has been evolving over the 6 weeks that or maybe even 8 weeks that we decided that we were going to start teaching this stuff. And the promo for tonight's described that we're going to talk about the destruction of the temple and then what happened to Palestine and even to Rome during those decades early on in early Christianity, and also in Judaism as we know it. I'm going to say up front, I am not an expert in Judaism, and for fear that I would inadvertently be insulting, I will try to keep what I teach you about Judaism as limited as I can, and only as a reflection of the kinds of theology of Christianity that I think are important for us to discover or to discuss when we're talking about early Christianity. So if you don't mind, I'll get into that again in a little bit. And here's one more part of the preamble that I would like you to do. I'd like you to work with me on 4 short thought experiments before we go into the actual content of the lesson. The first one that I would like you to do is I would like you to think back in your life to very important events. I don't know what they might be for you. Certainly events that are very important to me are the day I got married, the day my children were born, things like graduating, my children graduating. I just want to make the point that I am now the same person I was back in that day in some respects. I was there and I saw it unfold. And those were moments that were very important to me and very much a part of my life. But as I look back 10 years ago, this is the thought experiment. You look back in your life 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or dare I say it to some of you, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. Can you tell me what you were doing, what life was like, what you were like, and how those events that happened in the intervening years, what happened to the same person you are today, but in very real ways made you a very different person than you were back then? I remember when my oldest son was born, and I had the most intense feeling or memory of, oh, now it really matters. And I just, that's enough of that little experiment. Wave if you have caught that or if you need a little bit more time. Okay. The second thought experiment that I would like you to do is I would like you to ask yourselves, what is similar about these stories? If I say to you, the Jets and the Sharks, or if I say to you, Montague and Capulet, if I say to you, black hats and white hats, if I say to you, what are some other ones that might come up? When I was a little kid, we always played cowboys and Indians. That's not a correct thing to do today, but I did it. One of the things that we do in the church today is we look at ourselves as Christians and we talk about the Pharisees. And I just want to do a little experiment with you, a thought experiment. I want you to consider what we're doing when we use those little little vignettes in our mind. Those are shortcuts to describing what really happened. They are not what really happened. And so when we talk today, particularly when we get into the section where we're going to talk about the burgeoning gap between the Christians and the Jews, we need to be looking carefully to make sure that we have not loaded the word Jew with 2,000 years of Christian bias and maybe even unchristlike behavior on our knowledge of them. So we're going to get into that, because this period that we're talking about is the period when the two faiths began to separate and say to each other, "You are not me, and I am not you." There's another thought experiment that I want you to do, and that has come to me out of Princess Bride. Do you remember how Vizzini was constantly saying, "Inconceivable"? And then something else would happen, and he'd say, "Inconceivable." He was always upset about what new outrage happened. Inconceivable. Until finally, who is it? Inigo says to him, "That word you keep saying, I don't think that word means what you think it means." I would like you to be thinking a little bit about that when we get into a conversation about what it means to say Pharisee. And finally, in Ezekiel chapter 10, there is this moment that happens. Ezekiel's describing that this temple that has been their mainstay, that has been the center of their faith, this temple that has been kind of a shield, and they know that God will take care of them, the Jews do. They know that God will take care of them, and they are practically invincible because God is there in the center of the temple, until Ezekiel says, "I looked up and I noticed that the Holy Spirit, or that the Spirit of God, lifted up high in the heavens and crossed the threshold and flew away." It's a moment that came back to haunt the Jews going into Babylon, coming back, because it was that moment they could pinpoint when the Holy Spirit of God, the God that dwelt in the temple and that made the temple the connection, the nexus between heaven and earth, that God left. And, they waited their time in Babylon and went back. Ezra and Nehemiah rebuilt a temple. It was a poor imitation of what Solomon had done. And even when Herod came along and said, "I'll make you a much better one," the constant question of the first century Jew was, when is the Spirit of God going to come back to the temple? That's your fourth little imaginary inside. What I've done is I've pulled these ideas into the air, and I hope that you can capture them while we launch into a conversation about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. This is the event that is the nexus for the building of modern Judaism and for Christianity as we know it. Aside from the resurrection of Jesus, which the Gospels say was an event that was real, an event that was earth-shattering to them, an event that they believed in, that the Gospel writers believed in, that Paul would die for, but was largely ignored by most of the people who lived in Palestine during the time that Jesus lived there. And so consequently, the gospel writers say to us that, do you remember the time when, for instance, when John the Baptist came and he told everybody, and he had that little spat with Herod? Do you remember the time when Quirinius was governor? Do you remember the time when Herod killed all those babies? Well, that was the time we're talking about when Jesus walked on this earth. We sometimes think of Jesus as if he was the mega personality. He was the rock star. But according to the Gospels, he was a quiet man, did extraordinarily surprising things, and then went to the cross for us. And Rome barely even paid any attention. And the people of Jerusalem wanted to ignore and were even insulted that their system, their society, their way of doing things could be called to account to the injustices that happened to Jesus, and became part of the reason why the early church was persecuted. So we've been dancing around the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem over the last 6 weeks, but we want to be talking about it and making it really clear that the destruction of the temple is pivotal to how the early Christians thought of themselves, how Rome thought of Palestine, how the Jews thought of themselves. The magic date is 70 CE. I was going to say as the bit of the tagline for my presentation, put a pin in it. 70 AD is put the pin in it. And here's the reason why I asked you to do the experiment about what was life 10 years ago for you? What was life like 20 years ago for you? What was life like 30 years ago for you? Because 70 in the Common Era is roughly 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Raise your hand if you can remember 40 years ago. Raise your hand if you were alive 40 years ago. And not everybody has to raise their hand, I understand. So 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, there was the destruction of the temple. It was not an event that just happened in a pinpoint time, come out of nowhere, and everybody was surprised. Oh, no. The Gospels and Paul tell, and Luke, Paul's companion, tell the story about how the early church had to endure a restive population, had to endure, particularly the Jews in Judea, had to endure this crisis that was in the air all of the time because of the people's agitation over, there would be the Romans, there would be about the Hasmonean aristocracy, about the way that the temple was being administered, about the injustices and the expense of having to pay for taxes for this and for that and for something else, about the way that people were trying to bring this holiness that had left the temple back to Judaism so that God would be on their side. They thought that God was largely on their side, but the evidence wasn't there because the Romans were visiting all the time, and the Greeks, well, they brought their polluting kind of culture and religion and ideas. So I want to talk a little bit about what holiness looked like back in that day. The center of Jewish culture at the time was the temple. And the way we speak about the Judaism of that time is the Judaisms. Pastor Tyler did a great job last week at talking about the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes and the Zealots. These were all national efforts to make sure that this culture, this country, this group of people could throw off all ugliness and persecution, all the nations that were still keeping the Jewish Davidic kingdom in exile and keeping the Jewish people down. All of those ways of thinking about Judaism were largely centered on the Torah, on the way that the scriptures were practiced, particularly in the sacrificial system that was happening at the temple. The temple was the very center of their life. Even the Essenes, who had decided that the people who administered the temple down there in Jerusalem were so corrupt that they needed to go out into the Judean desert. They needed to go up there past Jericho and live in a kind of hermetic community and be the people of righteousness, still live their life in reaction to this temple. But the idea of each group was, this is how and this is how you need to practice your holiness in order for God to come and to help us throw off the Romans. They had an idea that a king was coming, a Mashiach. We've anglicized it so that it becomes a Messiah. We've taken the Greek word Christos, and we've turned it into Christ. But in the time of Jesus, there was this thought that things are not as they should be, and so we need to take action. In particular, each of these groups had an idea about how you are supposed to practice so that Messiah will come. And it's the old idea that if we are holy enough, if we do it right, if we continue to be God's people in the way that God told us to be, if I can get you to be like God wants you to be, then maybe we will be holy enough and God will come back. There's that dynamic happening in so many different ways in ancient Palestine. And roughly speaking, that dynamic started out strong enough. People were willing to get along with the Greeks for a while if they could, if they could get some of the benefits of the Greek culture. People were willing to go along with the Hasmoneans if they could. And they were largely Hellenistic, but, they had been able to throw those awful Seleucids. Do you know that the Seleucids were people who deliberately put like a statue of themselves in the holy of holies, in the holiest place? Antiochus Epiphanes sacrificed a pig on the altar. They used to come into town showing that they were the big man on campus and going to show how they dominated the Jewish people, and they would profane the holy precincts of the temple. And that was the fuel that helped the Jews to revolt against the Greeks during the Maccabean Revolution, and, surprise of all surprise, knocked the Greeks out. It led to 100 years of a Jewish kingship. During that Jewish kingship, they were able to add to the work that Ezra and Nehemiah had proposed. During Ezra and Nehemiah, the people coming back from Babylon wanted to be more Jewish than their Jewish fathers. And so they put on laws on themselves. They interpreted the scriptures as they were given to them, as they remembered them, and made it so, for instance, that if before the return of the exiles, a man had married a woman from down the street or across the valley, particularly if she was a person, say an Edomite, or she was from one of the nations that had come in and occupied the land after the Babylonians had taken the Jews, or the elites of the Jews away. At the construction of the temple that Ezra and Nehemiah built when he was rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, the people told themselves, we're going to be even more pure than the people of our fathers. We're never going to do again what our fathers did, forgot God and disobeyed him. We're going to be more holy than they are. And so what they did is they told men who had married the women who were living nearby, but who did not have a good Jewish pedigree, they told them, you are divorced from me, and you have to, I don't know what you're going to do, but you're not going to be my wife anymore. Among other things, they created a whole culture that was built on the Torah, which was an emphasis on making sure that there was no pollution on anything. Lots of extra baptisms. The clothes you wore could not have two different kinds of threads in them. They had to be pure. when you went to pay your bills, or when you wanted to buy a sacrifice, maybe you weren't very rich, and so you needed to buy a dove or some other kind of not very expensive animal to be burnt on the altars for your sin. Your money that you used every day was not good enough. You had to turn your money into silver coins that were from a particular part of Palestine where they actually made money or coins that were more pure than everybody else's, using more silver or more gold than everybody else's. When you hear about the story about the 2 drachma tax, and you talk about the temple tax and those kinds of things, the reason why people needed to pay for those, or needed to have money changers in order to pay for those, is because the rule of the day was we needed to have the money be purer than everything else. And that applied to the way that people needed to behave. There was an emphasis on, you will follow the law, and so you will not work on the Sabbath. Or if you have to for this or that reason, there was a hedge around it so you didn't break the rules. You catch my picture? That this was a culture. This was an imported idea. A lot of the ideas were imported from Babylon, a Babylonian idea of how to be Jewish. And these Jews were making themselves very, very different or very, very unique. They made a culture that was different than the rest of Rome. In particular, they had one God where the rest of the world around them had many different gods. And the precincts of their temple was holy. And there were degrees of holiness. And as you approached, you cleansed yourself and you got closer and you tried to be holier. So that, and even to the point that there were places in the temple that were totally off limits unless you fulfilled this or that holiness rite. Catch my drift? Strong in the Jewish culture, in the culture particularly around Jerusalem. In my Sunday school class, I've likened it to the way that Leavenworth in eastern Washington has become more Bavarian than Bavaria is. It's a tourist destination. It's a place with an idea, and it's a place that's run with very real consequences in people's life. But the idea is we're going to make this place holy. And the culture that Jesus was born into and that he was ministering into was rife with this concept of holiness. And Jesus, when he talks to us and teaches us what God expects, has to navigate through these people, some of them ordinary folk who, they live their life any way they can. They make their money any old way they can. They make their living any old way they can. And another group of people in the scriptures, we often hear about them as the scribes and the teachers of the law. Those people said that there was a very specific way that you had to obey. And you sometimes, according to Jesus, sometimes the ways that they decided to be holy were ludicrous because they got mad at, for instance, Jesus walking through the grain fields, hungry, and just as you do, eating some of the grain, and it happened to be a Sabbath, and were condemned for working on the Sabbath. Or there was that time, or 2 or 3, when Jesus saw somebody who was crippled or who was blind, and what did he do? He looked at the person and healed them, and the scribes and the Pharisees were more interested in their definition of holiness than they were in actually helping somebody be healed, somebody to be whole, somebody hungry to be fed. So during the time that Jesus was ministering, there was this growing agreement or this growing idea, this philosophy. And it isn't like it was a brand new idea. It had been growing for 300 or 400 years. It had been growing even exponentially in opposition to people like the Herods and the Hasmoneans. Jesus certainly had to face the people who were fussing with him about what holiness means. And as it was growing, people got harder and harder and harder in their ideas about what right and wrong was, about what it meant to be a Jew, about what it meant about being a Jew that was going to follow the Messiah, about what it meant to not be a Jew. The question of the day was, who is a child of Abraham? Who gets to fulfill the promise that God promised that he would walk with the children of Abraham? Have I been strong enough on the idea of the emotional attachments and the conflict that was happening at the time that Jesus was there? And it led to the murder of Jesus. Bad enough. Over time, it got worse and worse and worse. People becoming more nationalistic, the Jews. The scriptures often say things like, oh, you know about the Jews. And Christianity has turned that into an epithet. There are Christians who, in fact, even to say, oh, you know what the Jews do, or you know what the Jews did, is we're vibrating so much to the 2,000 years of the hatred of Christians towards Jews that we think that that's what the gospel writers were saying. What they were actually saying was, there's people who live down in Judea, as opposed to, for instance, the people who lived in Samaria, who did not agree that the temple was the center of Judaism. Or the people in Galilee, who had a much more cosmopolitan, let's get along kind of attitude, let's all get along attitude. As you left the centrality of Jerusalem, the Jewish diaspora became more and more and more, we want to be good Jews. We want to follow the God, Yahweh, but a little bit more understanding. The larger portion of the God seekers or the Gentiles who were interested in the Judaism the Yahweh or the God of Judaism, they liked what they saw in the Jews that were across the diaspora. And this is what led, for instance, Paul being able to go to the churches, to the synagogues in the diaspora, who were much more, oh, well, we understand about the Romans. If we have to walk past one, it's not a national crisis. Not like it was downtown. Not like it was in Jerusalem. When Paul went back after his missionary trips, scholars still wonder why he did it, because he was the one who was advocating that the followers of Christ needed to be people who would let the Gentile come in and begin to worship Jesus, and we wouldn't ask them to take on all of the Jewish rules. But when he came back to Jerusalem, he had his disciple Timothy circumcised because he didn't want to create offense. And yet, at the same time, there was the rumor among people living in, coming daily to the temple, when Paul took Timothy to the temple, the rumor went that he's brought a Gentile to the temple. It was that rumor that got Paul arrested, nearly killed, and Paul fortunately was able to appeal to the Roman procurator and ask for assistance. So you see that even by the time we're getting to the 60s, that's when Paul is let me see if I can bring up this little picture. Do you see how, can you see that my arrow is aiming at the 70? Anybody there can see that I'm doing that? Okay. The yellow dots are years, and I'm trying to describe to you that in the 15 or so years before the destruction of the temple, the people of Israel were becoming more, I mean, the people of Judea were becoming more and more nationalistic. And there were daily, if not more often, fusses with the Romans and the Greeks about just precisely what the privileges of being Jewish were supposed to be. And during the decade of the 56, 57, 58, 59, 60, that's the years that Paul is in. First, he's in Asia Minor, and then he goes to Greece. He makes a couple trips to Antioch up north, and it's by the time he gets to 63, 64, 62, 63, 64, that the idea is so strong that it's really a different Jerusalem by the time Paul comes back from all of his missionary tours than it was even from the time that he was there. When he was when he was standing at the feet of Stephen, who was telling everybody, you know, you're the ones who killed Jesus unfairly, and you're the ones who are stiff-necked. That's in the 10 or so years after Jesus' resurrection. Then there's a space of time where Paul sort of goes chasing after the Christians up in Antioch, up and down the coasts, with letters from Jerusalem that he was going to try to forcefully reconvert them back into Judaism. And then the call of Paul to go to the Gentiles in Asia Minor and into Macedonia is happening in the decade of the late 40s and early 50s. So those are the years, the late 40s and 50s, are the years that Paul is writing the letters to the churches in Macedonia, in Asia Minor, even in Romans. In 60 AD is when Paul starts to make his way back to Jerusalem, and he brings that person who is perceived to be not Jewish to the temple and creates a riot. And by this time, the Romans had had just about enough of the Jews. Listening to the politicians today about needing to dominate the protests that are happening, here we are again, is this story of the Romans looking at all those people. Maybe the Jews were thinking, we just want to throw off the pagans and the perverts and the people who are sick and who are keeping us from following and worshiping after the God of our fathers. But to the Roman perspectives, you know, we came in here to give you peace. We came in here to give you the Roman prosperity. We came in here to show you the benefit of Rome. And we're spending all this tax money on taking care of you and keeping you guys separated from each other all the time. And all you do is fuss and fight with each other. The Roman idea was that they were intervening because they were the good guys. Remember the part where I was telling you the black hats and the white hats and the Capulets and the Montague and the Sharks and the Jets, all those things? We sometimes, as Christians, tell the stories of those days as if there were the black hats and the white hats, and guess which hats we were wearing. Okay, let me push along a little bit further. So Paul's missionary trips, they're happening in the 50s. What is that? If, you know, I was born in the 50s. This is the 2010s, or 2020s, sorry. So 60 some years ago, that's what we're looking at. 50s to the 70s, down here, the 70s is when Paul, or when the Romans destroy the temple. The 50s are when Paul is writing to the churches and finding this incredible reception among the Gentiles about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But because of the nationalism, the people who were living in Judea, Paul's preaching was untenable. And when the scriptures, particularly in Acts, talk about how the people were, the the Gentiles and the Jews were becoming Christians, and they were working together and living together. But the Judaizers were coming up from Jerusalem. It was delegations from this radicalized people living in Palestine who were going up into Jerusalem, and they weren't particularly attacking Christians, but they were telling Jews, you need to be more holy. You need to do it our way. You need to follow the Judaism of the fathers. Here I have in 62, 63, the trial of Paul. All of these numbers are fuzzy because we don't have a very good diary about the particular times of those. And then I want to point out that Paul's trial is thought to be during the time of Nero. You've all heard about Nero fiddling while Rome burned, and then he blamed it on the Christians. During that time was the time of Paul's trial, but it was also a bad time for Rome. There was a, shall we say, a drought, a famine. The distribution of food didn't go very well. There were reasons why there wasn't as much food in Rome as necessary. And so what do you do when you are the empirical country and there's not enough food on your table? What you do is you demand that the colonies supply you more. You raise the taxes. And so the Roman courts and there had been failure of crops, so they began to demand more tribute from the colonies. This was on top of the anger that the Judeans had. Judea, Samaria, Galilee was the breadbasket of Rome, and the the Jews became very upset about the fact that their load became worse, even though they were working very hard to be more Jewish than they had ever been before. That unrest, or that challenge, made living in Rome really difficult, and everybody blamed Nero for it for lots of different reasons, some of them deserved. And so in 68, Nero committed suicide. He killed himself, and followed the 4 years. Well, let me back up. In 68, Nero killed himself. But in 66, that means 2 years before Nero killed himself, the Jews had had enough. They had the Romans had raised taxes. The Roman procurators demanded that the Jews pay for the taxes. The Jews said, we don't have enough money. So the procurator from Syria came down to the Jewish temple, and he essentially raided the treasury and took 17 talents of silver out of the temple. He just took it. The Jews, first of all, didn't appreciate the loss of the 17 talents, but they treated it as if the Roman procurator was a person who didn't have enough money. And so every time that the Romans would walk through Jerusalem, the Jews would pelt the Roman soldiers and the Roman officials with little silver coins and say, here's the spare change in my pocket if you need some, which infuriated Rome and the procurator in particular. And so he brought a legion or so, or people at his disposal down, and killed hundreds, if not thousands, of people, trying to put down the disrespect, is the way Rome described it. Well, as you can imagine, there was a particular uprising, and the Jews began to take on tactics that were at the very least, passive aggressive, and sometimes were reason for war. One of them is Jews had never been a particularly maritime people, but they began to take over ships and to pirate not just the foodstuffs, the grain and the wheat and the wine and the stuff coming from Judea, and barricade them so that and steal them, take them away as pirates away from the people trying to get to Rome. Not just the people leaving Caesarea or the Palestine coast. But they also began to attack the ships that were trying to deal with Rome from Egypt. They put in a barricade. So that meant the Romans had to not only bring in their legions into Palestine to fight and to protect the Greeks and the Romans, put down the rebellions of people who were just deliberately killing and hurting the Romans, but they were also barricading the riches of Egypt from getting into Rome as well. Nero was getting desperate. And so what he did is he sent his general Vespasian to Israel in 66, and he began to collect legions. Finally, when he got into Jerusalem, he brought 70,000, which was an unheard of number of soldiers. The Romans were furious. To say they were furious is even an understatement, because the Jews were pretty good at using guerrilla warfare, of attacking, of betraying, of creating moments of truce and then changing their mind. And maybe the person who was arguing or parleying with the Romans was arguing in good faith, but they were a fractured group. And so this group would agree to let the Romans do what the Romans wanted to do, or they would make some conciliatory efforts. And then another group would betray the agreement. So by the time we get to 68, Nero kills himself. Rome is upset. Rome cannot reestablish itself because of the famine. There are 4 men who become emperor and lose their life in the space of a year and a half. They call it the year of the 4 emperors, until Vespasian, the very general that Nero had asked to attack and to bring Judea under control, decided to leave his son Titus as the general of his armies, of his legions. And Vespasian goes back to Rome and becomes emperor. And so the story gets harsher and harsher. There are some very good YouTube video clips. In particular, there's one by Showtime called Kings and Emperors or something like that. The name escapes me right now, that describe blow by blow how this legion and that legion and another legion, and how the counter attack by the Jewish guerrilla groups finally subdued most of Judea, and then eventually destroyed the walls and took over the Temple Mount, so that in 70 AD, a Roman soldier tossed his torch into the 100-year-old, but by that time probably 80-year-old temple, and the cedar-lined holy and the cedar-lined Holy of Holies went up in fire and flame, and the Romans totally destroyed the place. They destroyed it, knocking, the place burned down, obviously. They pried off the gold. They knocked stone from stone from stone. They were furious. They took their hatred and their anger, kind of like an extreme adrenaline run. They took it out on the people and killed Jews in the thousands. They had killed people living in Palestine by the thousands on the way to Jerusalem. It didn't seem like they were sated by all of the blood. Rome just absolutely wiped Jerusalem off the map. And there was no more temple. There was no more way, no holy way, no legal way, no allowed way, no agreement among the Romans anymore that they could practice their old-time religion. And the Jewish people were devastated. The people who lived in Palestine, Jewish or not, found that they were living in this horrible place of famine, and many people left and were dispersed across the Roman Empire, some going west to Rome, some going east into what had been Persia, Parthia. Do you see here that during the course of the 50s and 60s, that's the period when there's this hyper-nationalism. You see that first Mark and then Matthew and Luke begin to be written. The thought is that the core beginnings of those books, that no one writer sat down one day and said, let's start at the beginning and write to the end, but that the passion stories may have been told first, and then the other stories were appended to the stories according to Mark. Matthew and Luke later, even in that decade or so, took the Gospel of Mark and began to say, this is what you need to know. And there's a tendency when you look at Mark to notice that Mark says, you remember that guy, you know, at the time of John the Baptist, the guy that Christians are saying was the Messiah? You know, nobody paid any attention to him. Nobody from Palestine even recognized that he was the Messiah. Nobody even thought that he was the Son of God, except, you know, that rare person from Tyre or Sidon or that Roman guard. An interesting way of putting things, as the people he's writing to are trying to understand the rebellion of the Jews that are in the air. And by the time you get to Matthew and Luke, it's really clear that they, if not aware of the destruction of the temple, they were aware of the horrors of what was going on in the countryside. You know, that whole passage in Matthew 24 where he talks about, watch out for that day that is coming. The writer of Matthew puts those words in Jesus' mouth, but he probably was experiencing some of them while he was writing. The rumors that were coming from up north or coming from down south or coming outside of Jerusalem. And there are some people, this is the reason why there's this gap or this spectrum of when Matthew and Luke were written, I've got in blue, is because it could have happened before the temple was destroyed, or it could have happened around the same time that the temple was destroyed. We don't know. But when we are reading the Gospels today, we have to be aware that those dynamics were happening in those people's lives. This was not a Christianity that was all about being really nice to each other and taking collection up on Sundays. This was not about well-dressed, well-coiffed people. This was talking about people who were living life just the same ways that you and I were living. But I digress. Let me see if I can go a little bit further. Now, what I've done in this is describe the next, or the 100 years from the time that Jesus was crucified and the resurrection, approximately in 30 in the Common Era, all the way to the Bar Kokhba rebellion, which would be like the Second Jewish War. It wasn't good enough that Rome came in and wiped Jerusalem off the map and dispersed people who were Jews and told them that they could not stay in Judea, Samaria, and Palestine. But Rome kind of casually over the next, particularly the 50 or 60 years after the destruction of the temple, Rome paid attention to Judea and sometimes didn't pay attention to Judea. And when Rome paid attention to Judea, usually the persecution of the people of the Jews increased. And when they didn't pay attention to Judea, people tried to rebuild the temple a little bit. They tried to establish order, maybe go out and clean out the front porch a little bit on their house, try to get along, maybe plant a plant or two. And then would come some rebellion until finally in 130, the Bar Kokhba, another rebellion against Rome, caused again by Roman overreach, the desire to to profane the territories, to kill Jews, and in fact, Hadrian under the Bar Kokhba, or in response to the Bar Kokhba, crucified thousands of Jews and lined the way to the Roman colony that they had established on the ruins of Jerusalem. They renamed Jerusalem as Aelia Capitolina. And from then on, Jews were not allowed to go back into Palestine. It is the reason why Jews were not allowed back for 2,000 years. That was the start of it anyway. As you're looking at this, you notice that the destruction of the temple happened in 70, but Judaism had to spend a lot of time just learning how to survive. Christians just needed to learn how to survive in the land. A lot of them left. And so by 90 AD, in that decade of 90 AD, I should actually make that picture of the Gospel of John a lot longer, because we don't know precisely when John was written. But the Gospel of John, as different than the Synoptic Gospels, the Gospel of John is being written. And it's being written to a community of Christians who have noticed that Jesus didn't come back quite as soon as they were all pretending or expecting or hoping for. And so John is answering another question than the Synoptic Gospels are trying to describe. So the Gospel of John, John of Patmos, John the Elder, is said to have been writing in that decade of the 90s. And some people even argue that it could have been as late as 100 AD, maybe into the 110s. I want to go a little bit further. The revelation of John, I'm sorry, I said that wrong. Let me clarify. The Gospel of John is thought to be by some elder that was leading the Christians in the community north of Jerusalem, certainly not John that was living in Jerusalem. The John of Patmos that wrote the Revelation is, by tradition, the same John as the Gospel of John, but they're among scholars who read the two and who are better Greek scholars than I am, can tell that there's a different writer, just like you can tell the difference between Shakespeare and, I don't know, James Joyce or some other writer. You can tell the difference by the way that they use the language and the pictures that they describe. But again, the Gospel of John and the John of the Revelation are trying to describe a Roman world, no longer a Jewish world, a world where Christians are clearly separating from Phariseeism, from Judaism, which has become Phariseeism, or Pharisees are the Jews that survived the destruction of the temple. Think about it. If the destruction of Judea comes to us because the Romans are attacking all of the little towns outside of Jerusalem on the way to Jerusalem to destroy Jerusalem, that means that the little communities like the Qumran community and the Essene community, might be the same thing, are people who are basically living out of town, but very vulnerable to the attack of Romans, who couldn't tell the difference between those Jews that are in Jerusalem and the Jews who said, I don't like those Jews down in Jerusalem. And so consequently, they have the story of the Qumran. It's clear that the Qumran members packed up all their bags, put their scripture into clay pots, put the clay pots up into caves that stayed there for, well, to 1948, from 70 AD to 1948, and have given us not just the scrolls from the Old Testament like Isaiah, but letters showing just how mad they were at the people down in Jerusalem. So the Essenes were destroyed by the Roman legions. The Sadducees were the folk who ran the building, ran the administration. And when there is no building anymore, there's no reason for a Sadducee anymore. And Sadducees were the ones who were complicit with the Romans and the Greeks. So nobody wanted to pay any attention to them. So the folk who were left after the destruction of the temple, the people who had a theology of, I don't know, maybe a holy living with God, the people who seemed to understand what was the mind of God, the people who could speak for the people or who could speak for God, were the Pharisees and the Christians. Now, they had very different views of how God was fulfilling the temple. And time began to show that the Pharisees were the first to begin to put the Christians out of the synagogue, to say, we don't want to do Judaism like you're doing Judaism. Jewish Christians were not particularly happy with that, but they became the minority as Christianity became more and more acceptable to Christians or to Gentiles. Let's see where I'm going next. Well, I got a little excited and I went talking faster than I could present. The coins that you see on this conversation about the Second Jewish War are coins that were established because, as I said, Rome sometimes paid attention, and when they did, Judea, Palestine had to obey the Roman way of doing things. But when Rome turned its attention to other things, the Jews tended to revolt. And what you see here are coins that were minted by Jews, by people who lived in Palestine who wanted to establish a Jewish kingdom. Admittedly, not a Davidic kingdom, not a Hasmonean kingdom, but for 2 years they were able to establish a kingdom until Rome came in and wiped them off the map. During the period between the First Jewish War and the Second Jewish War, and launching into the Second Jewish War, they established a 2-year of independence. The Romans came in and brutally, they remembered the First Jewish War, and where it took them nearly 8 years to manage the destruction of Jerusalem and the surrounding areas during the First War, it took them all of 2 years to pay attention and to totally destroy what was left of Palestine. I've already said this, that Jews were banished from the Palestine for 2,000 years. That's a typo. And I already told you about the destruction. I want to go back to the First Jewish War and tell you some things about the First Jewish War that are not often told in school anymore, but are still truthful. You noticed when we first came back to, when I first displayed this screen, I displayed the Colosseum. There it is again. That is the world famous Roman Colosseum, the largest of its kind in the world. Antique. Do you know how they paid for the Colosseum? Do you know why they built a Colosseum? Because when Vespasian left to become emperor and left his kingship, or left his son as general, there was a disagreement between Vespasian and Titus. By the time Titus took over the legions, he had had enough already of the way the Jews had been behaved. And so he destroyed Jerusalem in probably one of the bloodiest ways that this world has ever seen. It was so bloody, and the destruction was so thorough, and it was so punitive against this Jewish religion that had had special privileges in Rome and had special privileges for 1,000 years because it was considered older and more mature and more important and maybe more respectful than even some of the Roman ways of looking at the world. And for Titus to destroy, to wipe off the map and to utterly destroy the temple was not just a conquering thing, what you do when you are conquering another country, but it was a disgrace, and people were disgusted. And Titus, thinking he was returning to Rome in triumph, actually received a lot of anger and upset and destruction. It did not go down well. People were horrified. Romans had pretty good reputation, all in all. the iron boot and everything, but they had a pretty good reputation. But this was like another straw to break the camel's back. And so Vespasian and Titus had to buy a distraction. There had been that famine. People were not eating food. So he built this building out of the money that he was able to bring to Rome from the gold and the silver and the ornaments by selling all that and emptying it. That's what he did. And he bought entertainment for the Roman crowds. And that's the place where the stories began about gladiators and Christians and animals and stuff like that. It was an entertainment. It was a distraction so that people could get their minds off of the destruction and the kind of people that the Romans were discovering that they were themselves. The other picture that I used, I wanted to show you, is the arch. Well, let me back up a little bit. Maybe I can get to the arch in just a little bit. During this time, after the destruction of the temple, the Christians began to clarify and to codify their description of what atonement and what resurrection meant. Some people will tell you that the church didn't describe Jesus as Son of God until like in the 200s and the 300s. It's simply not true. There's evidence that we began to codify and explain and apologize and describe what it means that Jesus went to the cross, that what it means that there is a resurrection. It is a time when Christians and Jews began to anathematize each other and say to each other, "You're not doing it right." There was an intense feeling that you're not doing it right. You don't tell somebody to leave the synagogue and it just be a mild, like a disagreement over, I don't know, the budget, what color to paint the sanctuary. There was dislike and distrust beginning at that early time, but not to the ways that it became so that we have a Holocaust like in the last century, or even today in some of the ways that we talk about Judaism. And that's why I mentioned the part about inconceivable. When the Gospels talk about what happened about those Jews and what the Jews did, it did not contain all of the hatefulness that we have today. And I've already told you that it was during this period that we began to establish the Gospel of John and the Revelation of John. It helps you to understand that when the Revelator of John pulls back the curtain, he's not necessarily talking to you in end times, our end times. He's trying to describe to you how things are happening in Rome and how they're happening in Jerusalem and how they're happening in Antioch and how they're happening in even Babylon or other places around town, and how there are layers and there are levels of different influences and forces that are opposing Christianity, opposing the true believers in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But that God, all of this that is happening is in a kingdom that has not lost its way, that God is in control. And in fact, it's like a little tiny itty bitty 3-ring circus in God's throne room. God is in control of all those things that are happening. Well, I'm almost done here. Well, doesn't seem to be wanting to move any further. Okay, that's probably enough. Somebody want to turn on the responders or the questions? Oh, I was just going to say, maybe there's room for us to think about that when we're faced with our own level of protests around, when there are different opinions about what to do about the protests. When the Christian church has admittedly enabled some of this, maybe we should be people who can tell the truth and admit when we've been wrong and reach across the void to be more like Christ. I don't think we have to give up the traditions, the ideas, the stories that have made us who we are. We just need to be more like Christ and act more like Christ. Stunning, I can tell.
All right, I'm going to unmute everyone. Thank you, Bill, for that. Yeah, we'll see if any questions roll in. Sometimes takes a minute of reflection.
Well, can I ask a question? That might be the first asked question.
Yeah.
So, in particular to the people where this is new, what are you thinking?
They're still thinking.
Oh, some of you, your hair's pinned back. So, another question that occurs to me. Are we more like the Pharisees? Or are we more like Jesus?
Last week, Jesus not
Muted.
There we go. I had a question. I was wondering when you thought Hebrews was written, when you think about the way it talks about the separating from Judaism. Was it before the temple destruction or after?
I don't know. I found when I was studying and then even teaching Hebrews that I got mixed messages from the writer. I have a strong impression that it's written by somebody in Palestine who does not want people to become Judaizers, does not want them. She, that writer does not want Christians to fall back into the rituals. So if that is true, I mean, if my recollection is correct or my perception is correct, presupposes that there are still rituals, that there's a force or in the air is a kind of imperative that you need to get back to worshiping like the fathers taught us to, which means that maybe the temple was not, that the temple was still there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Just a reaction that I have.
Really quick, I just wanted to share something. This is from when we got to go to Rome a few years ago. And Bill, you mentioned this. This is the Arch of Titus. Can you guys see that?
No.
Oh,
yes.
It's coming. There it is.
So there's the Arch of Titus. That's exactly what Bill was talking about. That's very close, and I might have to unshare and reshare. Hold on to get a good zoom in. Though, can you see?
I have a picture of that.
Can you see the zoom in there?
Yep.
And you see that Vespasian there, right? This is again not far from the Colosseum, and then the one I was going to show the zoom in, which let's see, right. Let me get this right here. This is up close on that.
Yeah.
And there you can see a menorah, right? This nearly 2,000-year-old arch, and there they are carrying plunder right from Judea. So
that's inside the arch. that's looking from inside the arch
Mhm.
at the side.
Oh, we might have a couple chats that came in. Oh, okay, we got that one. When was Jim? Do you have any thoughts on Hebrews?
You already said. Yeah.
Oh, Jim did.
Yeah. Oh,
Okay.
not Jim. I'm sorry.
Bill did.
Bill did. Sorry. Jim's
Jim-
muted.
Jim's still muted. Yeah.
No, I unmuted myself. Bill's right. I mean, the clinching argument for Hebrews would be you don't want to go back to Judaism because the temple's been destroyed. And the fact that he doesn't make that argument anywhere in the
Right.
in the letter means probably written before 70 AD, before the destruction of the temple. Yeah, that's the majority position.
I always like questions about what it means. For instance, that Paul's letters were given to us first, and then the Gospels were written. Or questions like about, well, then what is the reason for the epistles? Or what timing of Luke and Acts? Those kinds of statements, or those kinds of questions or comments. Does that change the way that you look at one of the things I'm always surprised at is Christians who think that the scriptures sort of fell out of the sky one day, like the Mormons say. But these are clearly letters that are written to us, people inspired by the Spirit, giving us information about their time so that we are better equipped to serve Christ and serve others in our time.
You know, it seems interesting that in Mark is such a short letter, and he just sort of says, this happened, and then that happened, and that's it. But the people, if that was written early, then the people would have kind of maybe known that, or they'd heard those things, where Matthew gets, really detailed about how it relates back to Old Testament scripture and how this prophecy is fulfilled and all that kind of stuff. It's like he didn't think Mark gave enough information, or maybe they weren't in such desperate times that they needed all that extra. I don't know. It's interesting to think about different times where their peril was higher as the years went on.
Very perceptive, very perceptive.
So the early church tradition is that Mark is writing down the memories of Peter, because Peter, like Paul, dies in the midst of the Neronian persecution following the Great Fire of Rome. That's early church tradition. External evidence from outside the gospel. Evidence from inside the gospel says that usually things proceed from shorter stories to longer stories, exactly like you said, Margaret. And so most people place the writing of Mark somewhere around the time or just after the time of the Neronian persecution, within a decade after that time. And then Matthew and Luke come later on, because both Matthew and Luke feature Jesus' prophecy about the destruction of the temple in their retelling of Jesus' eschatological discourse, the one about the end of the world that he says when he's in Jerusalem in his last days. All the Gospels have a version of that.
Yeah. He says, don't bother going down and picking up your cloak. Run.
Right. It's coming up pretty close after that.
Yep. So it's not just a theoretical idea about some future that he saw in a dream. It's Jesus' words suddenly becoming alive to him as he's watching the steel-booted Roman soldier coming down the road.
Exactly. Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Bill.
I was going to say this is quite a deep dive. Bill and Jim, you may have an idea. Everyone got an Amber Alert.
Okay.
I think.
Sorry.
Oh no, you're good. Out by Lake Chelan. Yeah, this is a bit of a deep dive. I don't know if there's a more accessible version, but we have a Rich Buckham on this call and at CKBC, but there's a preeminent New Testament scholar, a guy named Richard Bauckham at Cambridge, and he wrote a book. It's like 500 pages, but it's the Gospels. Oh, am I there, or am I
Pause. Something happened.
Yeah, you're back. Jesus and the eyewitnesses.
Yeah, great. And it's, his whole thing is he looks at, he goes, don't read the Gospels as histories per se. Read them as eyewitness testimonies, and there is a difference, like Bill was touching on tonight, in the way that there's interpretation going on. A history, you're trying to be more objective, but this eyewitness testimony, they're interpreting current events, but they're still telling the story. And Bauckham goes through and he looks at that genre in the ancient world, and he says that, that telling the story accurately was still very much an important.
Oh dear.
Oh, lost me.
Boy, you should hear yourself.
Brenda, you're in church.
Yeah, and take two.
Or it might just be a sign from either the Spirit or Zoom to.
It might be the Amber Alert.
Yeah, well, if it goes out a third time, I'm just gonna say, very much like what Bill said. He just talks about, if you read to read the Gospels as eyewitness testimonies versus as histories. And eyewitness testimony was very much a genre in the ancient world that was concerned with telling the story accurately, but also telling it in a way that shed light on the current events that were happening. And so, it's always a little bit tricky. You're trying to determine when Mark was written by the context around it, and then see how it speaks to the context around it. So at some point, you're going to miss out on something. But it certainly, hopefully, this timeline Bill gave you gives you some sense of what the gospel writers were doing. Yes, they're telling the story of Jesus Christ accurately, but they're also interpreting the events that are happening in their time.
Right. So just to add one more chapter to that, Richard Burridge comes along with Richard Bauckham, the two Richards, and really have changed the way that that we look at the Gospels in the last 20 years. And we used to look at them as, if you were a scholar, as something that was unlike any other kind of literature. And so Richard Burridge came along, put all of the material into the computer, and said, actually, they're a lot like what ancient classics talk about as BOA, or lives. And lives are eyewitness testimony. They value eyewitness testimony very highly. And at the same time, they want to present a life for a reason, for a purpose, in order to address a situation like Tyler was talking about just a minute ago. And it's that combination of, it's the way that you write a biography of a person. You talk about, there's a standard form for doing this in ancient literature, Roman literature. They're Roman lives, Greek lives. And the Gospels are like that. But they're unlike that as well, because they are written for a different purpose. They're written for audiences to address situations. And if Mark is indeed written, as the majority of scholars now think, for a Roman audience, sometime during or just after the Neronian persecution, then Mark is writing the kind of story that kind of audience would pay attention to. And it is a very much action-oriented story. You're Roman, and you're interested in an action-oriented story. So Jesus moves quickly from one place to another. That part you can understand. The other part about him being, this fellow who keeps talking about suffering and who dies on a cross, for heaven's sakes, no, And then Mark ends in this strange place with this strange ending, with women discover the tomb empty. That's it. You figure out who he is. And Helen Bond is a New Testament scholar from the University of Edinburgh. She's just written a book about the Gospel of Mark. If you're interested, it's really, really good. I'm just getting into it. It's called The First Biography of Jesus. The First Biography of Jesus. She picks up Richard Burridge, she picks up Richard Bauckham, and carries it a step further, looking at the Gospel of Mark. And these are all highly respected New Testament scholars. Neat stuff.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Bill. It's we live pretty far north, so it's 8:30 and it's still light out. So you might even still be able to get out and enjoy. But do let us know. Let myself know. You can email me. You can email Jim. If you'd like to see this continue in some way, or if you have questions that are still lingering that you'd like to dive into, keep us posted on that.
Or topics that you want to address.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you
All three of you, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, good to be together, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you again, Bill.
You're welcome.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
Hi, Myrna.
Hi. I haven't stopped to make dinner, so I'll have to rewind it tomorrow.
I'll put the toilet in, so I'll see you later.
Okay, good.
All right, take care.
Thanks.